Hello, and welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew, and in this video, we are going to be looking at one of the warmest and driest parts of the Russian Federation, the Republic of Kalmykia. The Kalmyk Republic, or Kalmyk in the indigenous Kalmyk language, is located in the south of Russia, in the southern federal district, and in the Volga economic region. It is the 41st largest federal subject in the Russian Federation and over 29,000 square miles in size, making it larger than the nation of Panama. As of the 2010 census, it has a population of over 250,000, making it near the bottom in terms of population at a mere 78th position, yet still more populous than the nation of Sao Tome and Principe. Notably, the Kalmyk Republic is one of 11 republics in the Russian Federation where Russians are the ethnic minority. As such, both Russian and Kalmyk hold official language status. The Kalmyk Republic is bordered by the Volgograd Oblast to the north, the Astrakhan Oblast to the east, the Republic of Dagestan to the south, the Stavropol Krai to the southwest, and the Rostov Oblast to the west. Kalmykia is an incredibly flat part of Russia, traditionally included in the Eurasian steppe, and thus there are barely any hills, let alone mountains. The tallest point in the republic is Mount Sharad, at 222 meters tall. The longest river in the republic is the Volga, but only a mere 12 miles of it flows through the republic. Water access is a big issue in the region, with melting snow reliant to create pools and irrigation for crops and animals. The ecology of Kalmykia is in a bad way, and up to 80% of the region is affected by desertification. As such, whilst on paper over 15% of the republic is under plough with nearly 20% constituting forests, in reality both those numbers are smaller. The Republic of Kalmykia is divided into 13 administrative regions, with the capital, Elista, serving as its own region. The flag of the republic is a yellow background, with a blue circle in its centre. Atop this is a lotus flower. The yellow represents the golden steppe or sands of Kalmykia, the blue representing the eternal sky, and the lotus flower a symbol of purity and happiness. The flag was adopted on the 30th of July 1997. The entire region runs on Moscow Standard Time, and does have its own anthem which is playing right now. I will of course include a link below in the description for those of you interested. Whilst today we think of Kalmykia as a semi-arid region, up until recently this was simply not the case. Lush steppe grass grew plentifully across the region, expanding in all directions. Incredibly, this part of the world is thought to have been a heartland of sorts for two aspects of early humanity: language and horses. The Kurgan hypothesis links the many languages as far away as Irish and Bengali with one origin, a proto-language spoken somewhere in the Volga Basin region. It is unclear whether these early language speakers lived in the modern republic or simply adjacent to it. Nevertheless, they would have spread out over an enormous area, carrying their language both east and west. Additionally, the domestication of the horse is thought by scholars to perhaps have occurred on the steppes of Kalmykia. It is worth mentioning that horse domestication did not just occur in one place on the entire planet. There were many pockets where this happened to, but one of the earlier centres of the Yamnaya culture was found in the modern Kalmyk Republic. It might be surprising to hear that both of these foundational theories are thought to have occurred either adjacent to or in the lands of the modern Kalmyk Republic. But as we mentioned earlier, traditionally, the Kalmyk Republic was a lush grassland. Flat, easy to travel terrain filled with pools of melted snow in spring and tall grass in the summer lends itself to migration and travel, themes of much of Kalmykian history. Around 1000 BC, according to both Greek and Akkadian sources, Cimmerians arrived in the region. This group had been postulated to have been fleeing drought elsewhere, as again Kalmykia was a verdant green paradise for much of its early history. This made it a perfect place for nomadic people to graze their horses and recuperate their numbers, as well as hide from their enemies. The Cimmerians were noted as capable fighters by both the Greeks and Akkadians, and some degree of trade did occur with these nomads. As is often the case with nomadic peoples, the best grazing land is highly sought after, and around 750 BC the Cimmerians were ousted by a new group, the Scythians. The Scythians were a capable, warlike people who terrorized the Assyrians and the Medes. They would dominate the Volga mouth and surrounding regions until being ousted themselves by yet another nomadic group, the Sarmatians. This revolving door of nomadic invaders highlights the prize that was the Kalmykian lands. A fertile grazing land, near the mouth of a large river, and within striking distance of prized settled civilizations, yet far away enough to hide from any retaliation. After the Sarmatians came the Huns, who likewise raised their herds here, followed by the Sabir people in the 6th century AD. The Sabir raised cattle and raided their neighbours, much in the pattern as had been done before. But an interesting side note here, as we mentioned in our video on the Chuvash people, is some claim these are their ancestors forced to migrate north to woodier terrain. The Sabir reigned for over 100 years before being ousted themselves by the Khazars. The Khazars, as we have touched upon in other videos, were a nomadic empire who adopted Judaism as their state religion. The future Kalmykian lands were used for, surprise surprise, grazing. Whilst this may seem an obvious point, it does raise an interesting question about why there were no permanent settlements or structures to be found in this region. The Khazars used the Kalmykian lands for grazing, as everyone before them had done. Interestingly, aside from a few kurgans found in the region, there is no evidence of any permanent settlements here before the year 1000. And for good reason. The Kalmykian lands today consist of 3 rough geographical areas: desert, steppe, and black earth. But for most of its history, it only had 2 of these: steppe and black earth. The lack of consistent irrigation made settled agriculture untenable without technological improvements that nomads were not going to bring with them. Eventually the Khazars gave way to the Pechenegs. Unlike previous displacements, this was not a sudden and rapid change, however. This was in part because the Khazars were not just another nomadic group, but a semi-settled empire who had founded cities and roads and farms. By 960, however, the power of the Khazars was broken and the steppe given up to the nomadic Pechenegs. Khazar destruction did not come from the east, as had so many of the migrations, but rather from the west, from the lands of the Rus. The Kievan Rus invaded in that year, and this marks the first time that Russian power was present in Kalmykia. It would not return for another 600 years. Cimmerians, Scythians, Sarmatians, Sabir, Khazars, Pechenegs. The steppe had seen them arrive and would see them leave as well. When the Rus prince Yaroslav the Wise defeated the Pechenegs in 1036, he broke their monopoly on steppe power and cleared the path for another people, the Cumans. The Cumans would stay in the region for nearly 200 years, raising their herd on the lush grassland of Kalmykia, setting up tent within sight of the Kuma River, and migrating across the region following water. It's interesting to note how the names of the peoples in this region constantly change, yet the pattern does not. Migration, husbandry, and flight. The Mongol hordes washed over the Cumans, and by 1241, the grass steppe fed the ponies of Batu Khan. At first part of the Mongol Empire, over time the future Kalmyk lands would be assigned to the Ulus of the Golden Horde. By 1269, Mongols of the Mankeep tribe inhabited the steppe, as well as remnants of other nomadic people who had submitted to the Mongols. This was unusual for the Mongol conquest. Usually, regions were cleared away of life, and only small pockets of civilization, used for tax and manpower, allowed to exist. But in this region, Mongolian soldiers and their families actually settled. This was for a number of reasons. Firstly, when Mengu Timur separated from the Mongol Empire, he founded his capital at Sarai on the remains of the Khazar capital. This was within easy riding distance of Kalmykia. Secondly, the lush grassland had always encouraged nomadic people to settle in the region, and the Mongols were another nomadic people. The farmland and forests were the home of the conquered Slavic peoples. Mongols would thrive on the steppe. Lastly, Mongol wealth wasn't just measured in coin or manpower, but also in animals. And having a large grassy area devoid of predators made it ideal land for grazing herds. This view on pasturage made the Kalmykian lands highly prized, and thus, when war broke out against Timur-Lane, the region was swept of its goats, horses, sheep, and people. We mentioned earlier that the Mongols actually settled in this region, as opposed to dominating communities already there or living adjacent. This is important as the Mangit tribe who had settled there started to intermarry with the remnants of the Turkic people who had remained there, the ancestors of the Cumans, Pechenegs, and others. The Turkic communities here had a great impact on the Mongolian tribesmen, and from this region sprang a new horde, the Nogais horde. Taking their name from a former golden horde power behind the throne, the Nogais were an amalgamation of Mongolian and Turkic peoples, and would rise to power in 1440 with the fragmentation of the Golden Horde. The future Kalmykian lands would fall under their sovereignty, but life would continue apace, grazing, migrating, raiding and defending. The new century saw conflicts with the neighbouring Khazar Khanate in 1520 and the distant Crimean Khanate in 1546. Further assailed by drought and plague, an estimated 40% of the Nogais horde had perished by 1550. As the power of the Mongols had waned, the power of the Rus, or Russians as we now call them, were on the rise. In 1557, in exchange for protection, the Nogais living in the future Kalmykian lands would swear fealty to the Russian Tsar, putting them under Russian sovereignty. This was not actually entirely accepted by the Nogais people, and a splinter horde would break off, something we will cover more in our video on the Nogais people. Nevertheless, once again, Russian sovereignty held sway in Kalmykian lands, if only in name. Now, I keep talking about the term Kalmykia, but I haven't explained what the term Kalmyk even means. This is because the namesake people of this region arrive very late in its story. Far away in Outer Mongolia, a terrible power struggle had broken out between two confederacies, the Oirat and the Khalkha. Both Mongol confederacies were on the rise and were including as many other tribes as they could in their raids and battles. One tribe, the Torgut, opted to leave the region entirely to preserve their people. Joined by a few smaller tribes, these Mongols headed west seeking safety, and they travelled in their thousands. Safety is a relative term, however, and these thousands of Mongols would raid plentifully along the long route to Europe. Kyrgyz, Kazakhs, Bashkir, and Cossacks would all report Mongol forces approaching and retreat behind their walls when they could, as tens of thousands of Mongolian families poured over the steppe. By 1630, they had arrived in their new homeland. The arriving Mongols were brutal, and the Nogais horde, already weakened by years of fighting and plague, were utterly displaced, thousands slain as they fled desperately into Dagestan for safety. There is some academic argument about whether the Russian state allowed the Kalmyks to displace the Nogais, or whether they simply could not stop them doing so. Irrespective, the result was the same. The Nogais were expelled, and Kalmykia was taken by the Kalmyks. Founding the Kalmyk Khanate, the Russian state treated with them very cautiously. Astrakhan and Saratov grew steadily into trading stations where Kalmyk merchants and herdsmen would sell their wares. The Kalmyks themselves lived in a steppe lifestyle, raiding herds but not afraid to raid their Caucasian neighbours at the earliest opportunity. Extending their power base, the Kalmyk would both trade and raid with communities as far away as Bashkortostan. Regular contact with Cossack communities and the centralization of the Russian state meant that by 1650 Kalmyk horsemen were serving as cavalry in the Russian army. From this point, Russian influence begins to seep back into the region. On the death of Kalmykia, more power went to Russia, as Kalmyk nobles took bribes and allowed Orthodox missionaries to spread along their uluses. Nevertheless, the Kalmyk Khanate was a strong Mongol state, unlike anything that had been seen in the last 300 years. The arrival of Dzungarian refugees in 1759, who told tales of Ming atrocities, lit a match in Kalmyk national feeling. In addition, the Russian state had bribed its way into permitting Russo-German settler colonies on the rich Black Earth regions. And by 1768, Empress Catherine the Great was so secure in her position there, she began passing edicts edicts that limited the right of Kalmyks to roam. Enough was enough. The following year, thousands of Mongols would raise their tents, gather their herds, and ride back east towards Dzungaria. It is estimated that over 170,000 Mongols migrated, with much smaller numbers left behind in the steppe. These remainers even gained a new name from their Turkic neighbours, the Kalmyk, or Remainers. We will cover the history of the Kalmyk people in another video. But suffice to say, by 1771, the power balance between the remaining Mongols and Russia had grown so great that the Kalmyk Khanate was abolished. The land was put under the stewardship of the Astrakhan Governorate, and bailiffs and taxmen were arranged to visit the Ulysses. The once powerful and independent Kalmyk Khanate was no more, and the entire region now under Russian dominance. It is interesting to note that the Kalmyks, though much diminished, were still a dominant power and important player in southern Russian politics. Kalmyk nobles were petitioning the Tsars for the return of their Khanate almost immediately, and from 1800 to 1803 they were successful, as it was restored by Paul I, who, let's just say, wasn't very popular. The steppe had been valuable for a long time as grazing land, but technological advancements brought on the prospect of permanent arable farming in this region. Since 1763, small farming communities have been settled on the edge of the steppe, but in 1846 this policy was renewed with vigour. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 sped up the process, and the following year a new ex-serf, Stefan Kirkov, set up a homestead on a sandy gully in the neighbouring Kalmyks called Elson. 3 years later, this had grown into a small village and taken a more Russian name, Elista. The idea of turning this steppe land into arable farmland wasn't just for European settlers, and the remaining Kalmyks were encouraged to adopt a more sedentary agrarian lifestyle. Near the trading hub of Astrakhan, the Kalmyk region was used to raise livestock and produce for selling as far away as Central Asia and St. Petersburg. Yet, by the turn of the century, Elista was still just a village in size. Weirdly, this actually proved as something of a blessing, as during the Russian Civil War, cities and towns made for richer targets. The Kalmyk people, as were many of the people of the former Tsarist Empire, were split by the Civil War. Significant contributions to both Soviet and white forces were made by them. The region itself would only see light action as a result of its lack of population density, and by 1920 had been secured for the Bolshevik cause. The Soviets created the Kalmyk Autonomous Oblast, a subunit of the wider Russian Soviet Republic, with its capital at Astrakhan. This was a decision that the Soviets soon came to regret, as Astrakhan was far too big and multicultural to serve as the national capital of any one ethnic group. In 1927, the sleepy village of Elista was chosen as the new region capital, and funds allocated for infrastructure, buildings, and modernity. This is quite unusual in the Soviet story, but as a result of the growing Kalmyk community, the multiculturalism of Astrakhan, and the need to appeal to indigenization, this new settlement was created. The following year, it was reorganized into the Lower Volga region for ease of economic policy implementation. The 1930s would see dramatic changes in Kalmykia. Firstly, the industrialization of the Soviet Union caused the Kalmykian Autonomous Oblast to receive torrents of spillage, soilage, and various pollution. This caused great harm to the ecology of the region, particularly that along the Volga. Secondly, the religious heritage of the Kalmyk people was systematically destroyed. Buddhist temples, shrines, and monks were all liquidated, severing a link to distant Asia that had endured for over 300 years. But lastly, and perhaps with the most damage, it also saw the collectivization of the Kalmyk herds. The Russian government had been attempting to change the land of Kalmykia since at least the 1840s, with Tsar Nicholas I's foresting decree. But under Soviet rule, mass herds of cattle were created, with little regard to the viability of this long term. By creating huge herds, The demand for water and grass grew incredibly in particular regions. This was so much so, it began to exceed the replacement level, and thus desertification began. This was a slow process, and it wouldn't be until the 1970s that the true extent of this damage could be visibly seen. In 1939, as part of a general administrative reshuffle, the Lower Volga region was split, and the autonomous oblast was put into the Stalingrad Krai. The following year, this was upgraded to an autonomous republic. This republic status would last for 6 long years, until the German invasion. 1941 saw millions of people fight and die in Eastern Europe, and the line of battle drew ever nearer to Kalmykia. In 1942, the war arrived in the region in earnest, and German forces captured the new capital of Elista. Whilst partisan and Red Army fighting was fierce, a number of Kalmyks collaborated with the occupiers. Whilst not unheard of in the war, this was treated as national sabotage, with terrible repercussions for the Kalmyk people. Once the Germans had been ousted, Operation Ulus was launched. Systematically, all Kalmyks were rounded up and deported to Siberia. The Kalmyk Autonomous Republic was abolished. Their lands split between the Astrakhan, Stalingrad, and Rostov oblasts, as well as the Stavropol Krai. This punishment went so far as to completely rename Elista to Stepnoy, a more Russian name. The fate of the Kalmyk people is an important one, and one that we will cover in more detail in their own video. Suffice it to say, the 1940s and 50s were an incredibly hard time for the Kalmyk people. When Khrushchev rehabilitated the Kalmyks in 1957, their autonomous oblast was restored. This was, the following year, upgraded to autonomous republic status. It is worth noting that, like many places in the Soviet Union, the Russian majority held sway here. As such, when the Kalmyks did return, Soviet ideology and loyalty dominated. Earlier in this video, we touched upon the idea of desertification starting in earnest around 1930. This was accelerated by the 1950s, as vast canal projects were implemented to divert water to farmland outside the Republic. This in turn sped up the desertification project, as over-farming and depletion of water ravaged the region. Ever eager for higher quotas and production, none of the Soviet leadership would accept the looming disaster that was staring them in the face, and it was only in 1988 that the region was declared an ecological disaster zone.
1989 would prove to be a calamitous year in other ways as well. AIDS had been identified as early as 1981 by Soviet scientists, but a misconception existed that the disease could only be contracted by association with West or from developing African nations. That year, an outbreak of AIDS was identified at the Kalmyk Children's Hospital. From there, the disease would be recorded across Russia with alarm and suspicion. The spread of the disease, which soon encompassed many neighbouring regions, has since been identified as the result of poor sterilisation of needles and the sharing of them among the hospital's patients. Whilst AIDS treatment and understanding has leapt since 1989, Kalmykia holds the unfortunate title of AIDS epicenter of Russia.
In the dying days of the Soviet Union, the region was upgraded from an autonomous republic to a full republic in an attempt to keep the Union together. This failed, and with the collapse of the USSR came the flight of Slavic nationalities from the region. As the economy floundered and regular people found themselves out of work with no state support, nationalism arose. The region had had Kalmyk nationalists present from the earliest days of return. But in the late 1980s, this movement picked up speed. On the back of this, in 1992, the Republic of Kalmykia, Khamtanch, was formed. A republic for the Kalmyk people, it grew as part of the Russian Federation and benefited from its proximity to both Astrakhan, the Caspian Sea, and the Caucasus. Despite some revanchist sentiments in the 90s, the inclusion into this new Eurasian state led to an improved economic situation. However, this has been hampered by insufficient ecological support on both the federal and national level. In 2020, A report was issued that stated efforts to combat desertification have simply been insufficient, and the looming man-made desert region was probable in the next 50 years. Which ties us into the economic situation of Kalmykia. The Kalmykian economy is weak, even by Russian standards. It is more comparable to a Caucasian republic in that regard, and this stems from the fact that over 30% of their GDP comes from agriculture and husbandry, industries directly affected by the desertification. These two industries alone employ around 25% of the workforce, and apart from limited offshore hydrocarbon reserves, there is simply not much economic investment. A substantial portion of young Kalmyks are leaving the region, seeking better prospects in the richer cities along the Volga or in the north, escaping both the encroaching desert and a dearth of prospects. Like many places in Russia, the population has been decreasing for some years. Nevertheless, as of the last census, the population does stand at over 250,000. Kalmyks are the majority at 62.5%, with Russians making up over a quarter. There are numerous smaller ethnic groups that make up the remaining 12%, but the largest are the Dargins, who make up nearly 3% of the population. As of the 2012 survey, Buddhism is the largest religion in the region, at nearly 50%. This also makes it the only republic in Europe with a Buddhist majority. Christians make up nearly 20%, with the majority being Russian Orthodox. Both atheists and spiritualists make up 8%, with smaller numbers of Muslims, Tengrists, Shamanists as well. Nearly 10% of people asked gave no response. The fertility rate in the Republic is 1.3 children per woman, which is slightly higher than the national average. Drug overdoses are far lower than the national average, whilst alcoholism rates reaching nearer the national rate, though still below. The president of the region is Bato Kazakov, a mixed Kalmyk Tatar from Kalmykia. He has been in power since 2019 and, of course, is a member of the United Russia Party. Weirdly, before politics, he was a policeman and MMA fighter, leaving a lasting impression as a strongman for the region. Kalmykia is an oddity in the Russian Federation, as it is dominated by Asian people and Asian architecture whilst being in Europe. Were you to visit, you might see the Birken Bakshin Altan Suma Temple, the largest Buddhist temple in Europe, and Russian and Mongol-inspired architecture in Elista. The powerful Caspian Sea, from across which lies Kazakhstan, Iran and Turkmenistan. But what dominates the region most is the endless steppe, now turning into desert. Thank you for watching. My name is Andrew. Up next is the Kaluga Oblast. Paka!